one of the most critical philosophers in the history of the world, whom many consider to be the founder of post-Renaissance Western philosophy, was Rene Descartes. Now, Descartes was critical not only in the understanding of many modern philosophical concepts, but he was also one, like other theorists such as Aristotle and Claudius Ptolemy, who laid the foundation for future thinkers to ultimately come up with correct theories, as many of their ideas and propositions may have ultimately been disproved later on, but as I just said, laid the foundation for future theorists and thinkers to create more accurate propositions as to how the world operates. So let's get straight into it. The fundamental elements of Descartes' philosophy is the idea of rationalism. Now, rationalism is a little bit of a tricky, abstract concept in philosophy, so I'll try to explain it in very clear-cut terms. Basically, rationalism revolves around the idea that reason alone is the only ability needed by humans to understand the natural world. Basically, observations, using our five senses, conducting experiments, things like that, those are not accurate barometers as to how to understand the world around us. Because Descartes argued at the time, in the mid-1600s, that if this was universally employed, as it eventually was, he argued that human senses were flawed, and that basically the ability to perceive the world and measure things may be inaccurate, may be unquantifiable, or may just be on a completely wrong scale. So he believed that the only way to actually interpret the world that humans were within was to use our own innate intuition, reason, and logic. Now, let's kind of use some examples to understand exactly what he meant by this. So, for example, we do use rationalism on a regular basis as just basic layman humans. So, if we don't know the meaning of a vocabulary word, we might just use what's called common sense and place that vocabulary word into a particular sentence that we think best suits it. Or we might learn how to actually engage in a process like tying shoes through basic logic and rational reasoning, and etc. and etc. Basically, we don't use cause and effect. We don't necessarily use observational empirical analysis to understand how certain things work. Now, rationalism revolves specifically on a concept that Descartes creatively called Descartes' dilemma. What Descartes' dilemma is that, kind of similar to what I just said, we don't know the genuine truth behind things in the world. We can't accurately verify whether things are true or not because the senses that we use to uncover that truth may be flawed or inaccurate. So what he argued is that the only way to truly understand the basis of things is to, for instance, break them up into smaller units, to only focus on what we can actually illustrate, to only look at what humans can perceive in reality, and other examples. Now, the actual logical thought process that Descartes believed was essential to understanding how to use rationalism is called deductive reasoning. And to an extent, we still use deductive reasoning extensively today. What deductive reasoning revolves around is basically looking at the very broad picture, the bigger picture of things, and then going down to one central specific details. Basically, it's from the general to the specific. And what Descartes argued is that by doing this, by using clues and analyzing certain contexts of a situation, one could then come up to one specific cause for all of this. You look at the factors involved and then go to the particular central conclusion or central idea. So an example of this would be detective work. Many detectives, what they do is they look at all the general factors, all the general clues of a situation. So let's say they're investigating a crime scene and they see blood, they see a body, they find a murder weapon, it's in some kind of a dark alley where there's suspicious mugging activity going on. Through looking at all those general factors, what the detective will ultimately come to one single conclusion as is there was a murder here. By analyzing a lot of the general evidence and the general context of the situation, they've come to one specific concrete solution, or one concrete idea. And this is what Descartes believed was necessary in order to perceive the world in any context. Lastly, one of the most critical ideas that Descartes argued was the idea of Cartesian logic. And what Cartesian logic is similar to deductive reasoning. It seeks to understand the root of how we can approach situations in everyday life. So, through deductive reasoning, Descartes argued that there are about 4 main steps to this process. He argued that when coming across a particular situation, humans should, 1, consider what will happen if they don't do something, then 2, what won't happen if they do something, then what will happen if we don't do something, and then what won't happen if we don't do something. So basically it's a 4-step process to understand how not only we can approach situations as a whole, but what the consequences of our actions will be if we choose to approach them in particular ways. Now, to wrap this up, there are of course many different criticisms of Descartes' philosophy, and the biggest one is a philosophy that we really use today within the context of intellectual society, and it's what Sir Francis Bacon referred to as empiricism. What Bacon believed in a kind of a similar time frame as Descartes was that, in fact, the only way to really understand the natural world is purely through measurement and purely through quantifiable factors and through what he later dubbed the scientific method, and ways in which we can actually analyze the natural world through concrete observation and ultimately through analyzing very specific factors. You would then come to more of a general idea or general conclusions. What Bacon and empiricists believed was a different type of reasoning than Descartes. They believed in what was called inductive reasoning, where rather than going from the general to the specific, they would go from the specific to general. They would start off with a very specific, centralized question, or what's called in science a problem statement, as to what's going on in a particular situation. And then through observational analysis, the collection of data, and through observing the natural world with the course to their central question, they would then accumulate more evidence and more conclusions as to why that particular question is valid or invalid. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of not only Descartes as a philosopher, but the idea of rationalism itself, is a very curious philosophy proposed by one of the central philosophers of the 19th century, William James. And what he proposed was something called radical empiricism. What radical empiricism is it believes that there is no such thing as independent reason, or independent logic, or reason and logic that is independent of observation and empirical analysis. What James believed was that basically everything in society, everything that was ever observed in the natural world, anything that humans believed rationally, was based in science and empiricism somewhat. Basically, humans can't have independent reasoning without some kind of observation, whether they observed it or they're simply using the observations of someone else. So for example, let's look back at some of Descartes' examples and apply James's reasoning of radical empiricism. What James would argue is that, in fact, humans don't, for instance, if we look at a vocabulary word and we just put it in based on common sense, what James would argue is that no, we don't just use reasoning to understand that. The reason why we put the vocabulary word in that particular sentence is because we observed similar words in the past that use a similar sentence structure, or there are particular phonemes and morphemes, the actual structure of the word, that applies in this context, and etc., and etc. Basically, that there is no such thing as reason alone, that reason itself is based in empirical observation. So I know this is a bit of a mouthful and a lot to understand, but it is the basis of understanding the reason behind the natural world.